Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega and Jamie Soden. And on our last episode, George was trying to explain the attributes of God, and he was trying to make some point, which he kind of never got to because, Trick and Mitch were kind of interrupting, and I didn't get to say hardly anything, and Jamie didn't say anything at all, except I think he tried to, but was kind of drowned out. So maybe we could. The plan for this episode is we're going to do a part two to our last episode about the whole God thing. So I guess George can start this over again.
Okay, thanks, Chandler. Yeah, it's not so much that I didn't get to present my point, but um, it really wasn't accepted, and there wasn't a valid answer given to it. And the other part, again, I don't think that there was enough open-mindedness to the argument, the proof. Essentially, the proof is that that not just the pantheist God of God is simply the universe, but the Judeo-Christian Islamic conception of God, if we subject it to analysis via our science, our understanding of the universe, we have to conclude that logically this God exists. So let's start as we started last time. We'll use the standard two attribute definition of God that's found in so many dictionaries, and that's that God is the creator and ruler of the universe. Okay, before I go, I go further with this. Do you guys see how that God as the creator could be true, or what are your opinions on God being the creator?
Well, first thing is, if God is the creator of the universe, then it seems to me that would conflict with your pantheism, wouldn't it, of God being the universe?
Well, that's interesting because in a certain sense, you're right. It's a matter of, basically what sense we're using creator. Because in other words, like with our physical scientific universe, we have the observable universe, which is the universe that started with the Big Bang, and which is the only universe we have, any kind of access to in terms of information. But then our logic leads us to infer that, well, the Big Bang didn't just originate out of nothing, ex nihilo. Something might have caused it or must have caused it. So then we posit, yes, that there is a universe, a scientific universe that our logic tells us would have to be eternal. So Chandler, in the sense that you're using it, yes, that God or whatever it is created, our world or the Big Bang, scientifically, and that then both the universe, not the observable universe, and God would also have to be eternal. And you're right. The other part, and yes, there are other parts of pantheism that I don't also agree with. At least as espoused by Spinoza. Spinoza would not grant, I think, or did he grant Einstein wouldn't grant a consciousness to the universe, his, version of pantheism. And Spinoza, I think, Spinoza gave um, God attributes of like all goodness, which I can't defend. So yeah, this version is much more in line with the traditional conception of God, Judeo-Christian. But again, as you'll see as we go through these attributes, they got some of it right, but some of it obviously they didn't get so right. So Jamie, what do you feel? Do you see that the logic of defining God as the creator?
I don't really claim to know whether there's a creator or not. I mean, I've said I don't believe that there is a God because there's no evidence for it. That's just my opinion on the matter. Because, we have no connection to this quote unquote consciousness that you speak of. God hasn't had any role in our lives. Uh, so, why claim someone exists when you've never heard from them before?
Okay, again, we're basically like, subjecting the traditional definitions of God to an analysis. So, like, in other words, like, would we agree that the Big Bang event was the beginning of our observable universe?
That was the beginning of their observable universe, yes, but
Right. And Chandler, you agree with that also, or?
Well, I've tried to read about the Big Bang. I've tried to look on YouTube about the Big Bang, but it ends up being some kind of sitcom or comedy show, television show by that name. And so I actually don't know what the Big Bang is or how it happened.
Well, let's just go over it briefly. The Big Bang is simply like 13.8 billion years ago. The entirety of the universe, all these hundreds of billions of galaxies, apparently were condensed to the size smaller than an atom, which is like beyond, my ability to conceive of, but that's the standard science.
Well, that sounds weird. Like, how do they all fit?
Yeah,
So,
well, I know, but like, and the other part is that is, you know, we can't go back any further in time than that. That event is our first, observable um, phenomenon that coincides with our universe. So, in other words, that's scientifically the beginning of our universe, of our observable universe. And so,
well,
like, go ahead.
yeah, well, as far as whether the Big Bang theory happened, whether the Big Bang happened or the Big Bang theory is true, I'll remain agnostic on that. But regardless of that, since I'm using the universe and I think the sense that you are, everything that exists everywhere, it's eternal whether or not there was a Big Bang.
Right, but what I'm saying is, like, for example, if we want to be scientific, we can only guess at whatever came before the Big Bang. There's absolutely no evidence of anything happening before the Big Bang, right? So if we're applying this scientific criteria to what we accept as truth or not, I think we'd have to concede that, yes, it seems like, logic dictates that there would be, and that's where, like, this conception of God is defined as ineffable, as transcending logic, transcending space and time. So, in other words, like with the Big Bang, another conception of it is, or another criteria for it, is that apparently, as far as we know, that was the beginning of space and time. Space and time, at least as far as we can tell, didn't exist before the Big Bang.
Well, as far as space and time, I'm not sure I agree with that because first of all, time is just, a name that humans give to matter in motion, the speed at which things move and all. But I would just say that time would be synonymous with causality almost because things happen, things move, things change, And so I don't think that there was a before time. Time has always been.
Okay, Jamie, what's your take?
Sorry, repeat what you were saying because
What
I was kind of distracted.
do you believe that the time exists, like that time has existed eternally, or do you think
In
it
a
was
sense,
a
in a sense of duration, we have to conclude that time exists because duration is a very real thing. There's an end and then there's a beginning to each moment. You know.
right? And more so, like, and it seems like we have to conclude that, at least to our observable empirical evidence,
Mm.
um, time has to have had a beginning. And the reason I say that, and Chandler, I do agree with you that logically it would seem that time would have to extend before the Big Bang, you know, um, but using kind of like scientific data, we have to concede that time requires um, matter and space, because basically time is the measurement of matter moving through space. It measures the rate of it. So, like, if there's no matter or space, as as seems to be the case before the Big Bang, that's why scientists, would conclude that time could not have existed, before the Big Bang. Now, naturally, if there was a dimension of the universe, which again I'm kind of like defining as God, that existed before the Big Bang, then I would agree that time does, exist before the Big Bang, before the creation. But again, we can only guess at that. It's not anything that we have any observable evidence of.
Yeah. Here's one thing is as far as when somebody goes by observable evidence and what someone could have evidence for, I think I always remain a little bit of I don't know, because there's always things that could have happened that there could not possibly be evidence of. If you know what I'm saying.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. All right, and that's all right. So, like, basically, um, when we posit what caused the Big Bang, the most clear answer is I don't know. We don't know, right? That's the most honest, sincere answer.
Yeah.
But what religion does is religion terms the I don't know God. In other words, like, in science we try to like answer, well, what caused this? What caused that? Basically, religion just says, well, the beginning of everything, or what preceded the creation, that's what they define as God. And so from that logic, it seems that, well, if we have a creation with a beginning, as we do with the Big Bang, then it seems to make logical sense to term it, something, in other words, like the term of God for what created the Big Bang in this context makes sense.
So what you're saying is people, when there's something they don't know, they call that God.
Well, in this instance, yes. In other words, like they acknowledge that God is ineffable, unknowable in various ways, but the same logic that calls us to say that, well, time existed before the Big Bang and something must have caused the Big Bang is the same logic they use for saying, well, yes, we're going to call that something that created the world, that created the Big Bang. We're going to call it God. So it's simply giving a term to the unknowable.
Okay, I guess that kind of makes sense.
Okay. The second one is like, and I'm going through these 10 attributes of God listed in Wiki. Or no, actually, no, we're going through the dictionary ones first. So the first one's creator, second one's ruler. So like, basically, God is defined as the ruler of the universe. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think ruler, I mean, it has a tendency to be thought of as a king, you know? And I think Trick was trying to make that point last time. So when people think of a ruler, they think of, some king or some dictator that makes rules and laws that humans follow. But perhaps that type of ruler is not what you mean.
Right, are you guys on the computer?
Yeah.
Let's ruler definition,
Okay.
because I think you're right. I think words have different um let's see.
Well, ruler can also mean dictator because Adolf Hitler, when he was in power in Germany, he was known as a ruler of the Nazi regime, wasn't he? So,
Yeah, I have
Right.
my word web dictionary, which I always use, and number one is a person who rules or commands. And two is measuring stick consisting of a strip of wood, metal, or plastic with a straight edge that is used for drawing straight lines and measuring lengths. That's another kind of ruler.
Okay. Let me just. I want to try the Macmillan Dictionary. Um, commuting. All right. So like, yeah, I see these dictionary definitions ascribe rulership to a person, but what I'm looking for is I've seen this before in the sense that, like, the laws the universe is governed or ruled by the laws of nature. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is like to govern something, I think is the same as ruling it. And I think what they meant, hold on for a second. Ruler, let's see, Wiki. No, huh. All right, maybe rule instead of ruler. But see, we're kind of like exploring the concept. I think more so than the word. Okay, rule and ruling usually refers to standards for activities. Again, this is the Wiki page. In science, okay, let's see. Terms of describing all right, can we posit that to rule and to govern something is somewhat synonymous?
Well, yeah, I would think so. A governor or a ruler would be kind of the same in the human context anyway. And that's the way I think of it.
Right. So in this case, I'm not sure ruler is the right English term. Like I'm not sure what the Hebrew or Aramaic word, the original word for ruler in the Judeo-Christian tradition is, but I think it may, I think the basic concept is that, God as the ruler is omnipotent. That in other words, like God is sovereign, that whatever God, wants to happen must happen, and whatever God does not want to happen cannot happen. So can we kind of like agree that when dictionaries use the word ruler, that's the sense in which they're using it, that it's basically, that similar to the laws of nature, that the laws of nature determine what can and cannot happen in the universe?
Well, I would agree that when Christians or Jews use the term of God as a ruler or a governor, they are thinking of God as just like a human who rules a country or something like that. And so I would say that the definitions that are in the dictionaries are going to reflect the Judeo-Christian religion and belief in God because that's predominant in the world.
Right, but the point that I was trying to like get at with this is that when they use the word sovereignty, um, let's say in Hebrew, that what they meant. All right, let's see. I'm looking it up now. I guess it's called. All right, dominion, reign. Hold on. Basically, I think that the basic power is like, for example, sovereignty is defined as the ultimate source of authority and power of God. Basically, when I think of it as being synonymous with the laws of nature. In other words, like the laws of nature, the gravity, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, they determine what can happen in our universe and what can't. So do we agree on that, or?
Well, in a sense, like you might say that because of gravity, we can't just float around.
Right, and like the entire, again, that's why these are like the laws of nature. They basically you know they constrain the behavior of of objects within the universe. Gravity, the electromagnetic force, weak and strong nuclear force. I mean, then there's the chemical laws, these laws of nature, including causality. In other words, everything has to subscribe to this law of causality, that nothing can happen in the universe unless it's caused. So in that sense, in the sense that God is defined as the ruler, and more so like as all powerful, or all omnipotent, I think that that coincides with our understanding of what the laws of nature do.
Yeah, so would you say in that case there would be nothing that could override the laws of nature?
Exactly.
Yeah, because it's not like we can turn off gravity. It's not like we could slow down or speed up the speed of light.
Right. Now, the laws of nature can't make 1 plus 1 equals 3, right? And neither can God, right? So, in other words, like, we're not saying all powerful means that anything that we can conceive of can be done, right? It has to be constrained by what's possible.
Right. So we're basically now it's true that some theists do find omnipotence as even being able to do that which is logically impossible. But for the purposes of this, you're saying whatever doesn't violate logic can be done.
Right, and I would say those theists are clearly wrong. They're just mistaken, and again, this, I mean, like in science, we were mistaken, again, before the Big Bang was demonstrated. We thought that the universe was just like, wasn't expanding, was, our known universe was eternal. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, just as science kind of like changes its understanding based on new evidence, I think religion must too, if it's valid religion. Religion can, although it's slow to change, it's unfortunately much slower to change sometimes than science. The correct, definition, for example, of God is amenable to change. Okay, Jamie. So do you concur that basically um, defining God as all powerful would be synonymous with the laws of nature, you know, being all powerful over the universe?
Um, that's a tough one, really, because how I view omnipotence or all powerful is, the impossible kind, the kind that is usually attributed to, the Muslim or Christian God. You know, obviously what that type of God can do is impossible. So we know by default that there's no way that God can exist whatsoever. But the God you're talking about, you're saying whatever is logical can be done, right?
Right. Whatever is possible, that in other words, like the laws of nature, constrain matter to do what it, dictates they do. That constraints, like gravity mandates that objects pull toward each other, and if there's a dark energy, then it would like pull, matter apart and all. So,
Yeah.
but
So
right. Go ahead.
one fine example would be that God can't grant humans a free will because the concept of free will is an impossible and incoherent concept.
Exactly.
And like
Exactly.
George said, gravity does cause things to come together. I mean, there was an experiment done on the International Space Station where this astronaut put some salt or sugar in a plastic bag, and while they were in space, the clumps of like sugar or salt would, come together inside that plastic bag. So that proves um, that how planets were formed is dust and rocks and whatever accreted, just got bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually, you know, you have
Right.
a
And
planet.
so here's the point. Here's the point with, like, again, like, you're right, Jamie. Some theists would claim that God could do anything, and I would agree that's a wrong conception of God. Just like, for example, with gravity,
Mm,
um, it was at the time of Newton. Newton thought that gravity, worked instantaneously. But
mm,
then, like, after general relativity, it was discovered that gravity actually, operates at the exact speed as the speed of light.
Yeah, matter accretion is in line with relativity as well. It goes exactly in accordance to Einstein's calculations. The greater the density, the greater the mass, the stronger the gravity.
Right, and the point here is that just as like scientific, in other words, we don't say that gravity doesn't exist because Newton didn't get it exactly right. So in that sense, same sense, I'm not sure it would be right to say that God, isn't all powerful because the conception of all powerful that was used by some wasn't exactly correct. So basically what we're trying to do here is arrive at a rational, scientific understanding of this concept of God.
So, for example, you might be saying that there has been a misunderstanding of omnipotence, sort of like there's been a misunderstanding of the type of freedom used when people discuss the free will, for example. So people say, oh, you have political freedom, so you have free will.
Chandler, exactly. In other words, arguing against an omnipotence that can make 1 + 1 = 3 is kind of like arguing for certain, for example, compatibilist versions of free will that are not really the kind of free will that's under question.
Yeah. So, George, here's an interesting thing. Do you think that there was an understood concept of omnipotence before before Judaism, before Christianity, that was understood widely?
Well, I think what happened was my guess is that, like, for example, they saw clouds and they saw it rain, and they said to themselves, well, something must be causing it. And maybe then they saw lightning and they said to themselves, something must be causing the lightning. And they saw, it get hot and then get cold, and something must be causing the heat and the cold and all. And I think back then, since there was no science, they simply gave it terms. And we understand these terms that they used as quote unquote gods. In other words, like they called whatever made it rain something, and so what happened is, so they had these names for all these, what the causes of different phenomenon. And again, today we call them gods. I'm not sure they referred to them as gods then. And I think they probably did worship them. They thought, to the extent, certain extent, that they could, like, if they behaved in a certain way, they could influence, for example, like rain dances and all. But the point here is that, like, so they had these terms for these phenomenon. And then when with monotheism, I think, it was an Egyptian concept before it was a Jewish concept. They logically concluded, I think, that, wait a minute, if there are all these kinds of like forces governing different things, there must be one governing force that governs everything. And that was then the conception, the beginning of monotheism.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So now because they would see the weather patterns and they would see certain things happening, they would think that, well, there's something's causing this, and they also thought that by doing a rain dance or whatever, that there was something that they could please, that they could cause it to do differently. But then once somebody has the concept of gods or unknowns or whatever, then there's the idea that those are caused by something else and they're caused by something else. So they had a regression problem.
Um, yeah, and the regression problem was, I guess, ultimately solved by, you know, this idea that there must be one governing. I mean, they understood back then what we understand in physics now. In other words, with physics, we have the four fundamental forces, gravity, electromagnetism, the weak nuclear, and the strong nuclear. And, what Einstein tried to do for decades was to find a unified theory that basically would explain all four forces under one explanation. So that's basically what they did, several thousand years ago in terms of all these gods, these polytheistic, conceptions. They tried to just unify them within this one force that governs them all.
So what we kind of have is we kind of have the ancient first cause debate, because that seems to be what the major debate is between people is either there's got people saying there's a first cause and we call that first cause God. That's one of the definitions of God, is the first cause. And then other people are like, well, there's no first cause because there's an infinite regress, and that's kind of how I am.
Yeah, well, it depends how we're going to define reality. In other words, like for example, if as you believe, and I think as I believe too, there was a cause to the Big Bang, then what we're saying is that the universe didn't start with the Big Bang, and I think ultimately what we're saying is that the universe is eternal.
Yeah.
So if we conceive of the universe as eternal, I think then we have to also conclude that eternity can't have a first cause. Something that always existed, couldn't have been caused.
Yeah, because it's anything that begins to exist has a cause, is how I've heard it, and something that's always been around can't have been created or caused by something.
Right. So in other words, our world, in terms of our observable universe, had a beginning. It was caused, but whatever caused it, the universe or God, whatever, couldn't have. And so that leads us to another attribute of God as being eternal. God is like, one of the definitions is God is eternal. So I think we can kind of see how this defining God as eternal coincides with our understanding that the universe, that whatever created our observable universe, must also be eternal.
Well, yeah, because here's the interesting thing. The idea that God is eternal does mean that there has always been something. There has been an eternal reality and infinite regress, which I can agree to that.
Okay, all right. So again, so we've got God creating not the universe but the observable universe, by the Big Bang. Then we've got you know God's power over everything, again not being absolute, just as the laws of nature aren't absolute, but basically determining what can happen and what can't. And now we have God defined as eternal, just coinciding with the universe de- being understood as being eternal without a beginning, because again, how could it, it must. So we've got three basic, these are fundamental definitions of how God has been conceived. Now let's go through to a fourth one, which is omnipresence, or God being everywhere. Now, can we see how if the universe is everything, it must also be everywhere. So basically, if the universe exists, and is everywhere, then we can say that God is synonymous with the universe there.
Yeah, you would have to conclude that because omnipresence, something being everywhere, the only way to be everywhere is to be everything. Um, because otherwise, there's no way. For example, the way that the Christian God is pictured as being a person who's here and who's there, but can't be in more than one place. But at the same time, omnipresence is one of the attributes that's commonly been defined of God.
Okay. So now we've got four fundamental attributes of God that makes sense. Again, they have to be tweaked. It can't be like being able to make 1 + 1 = 3, just as the laws of nature can't do anything. But what can be done, is done by this being, whatever, called God. Um,
Yeah.
and
Before we continue, I want to ask a question though. Could, by what we're doing here, how we're defining God, could God raise life forms from the dead?
okay, my My understanding is that that hasn't been empirically. I mean, actually, I don't know because, like, I was going to say it hasn't been empirically demonstrated with science, but I mean, I was kind of like I was referring to human beings. We haven't been able to the best of my knowledge, have someone who's like dead come back to life. But the reason I have reservations about, concluding about this is because, like, I think they can freeze a goldfish for what, days, weeks, months, and then bring this goldfish back to life. Now,
Yeah, something like that. However, the reason I bring this up is because there's many people, it's very central to their religion to believe, for example, that Jesus was crucified and was dead for 3 days, and then rose again. Or in the case of, that Lazarus guy that was dead for 4 days, and then Jesus told him to come out of his tomb, and he did. So we're talking about somebody who's actually already died and been dead for some time being raised, as in the biblical stories.
yeah, I would be very skeptical about that. And also, like, I'm glad you raised this point because there's this one guy who debates scientists on the existence of God, William, I forget his
William
name.
Lane Craig?
Yes.
Yeah,
And
I
like
know him.
the funny thing about him is he starts out like I listened to a debate where he presented 6 points. The first point was that, like, the Big Bang and like the world having a beginning, means that God as creator is proven. That makes sense. The second point, I think, was like that God is all powerful, and I think the third point was that there's order in the universe. Now these are scientific, principles that he was presenting, and they make sense. But where he went wrong, then he says that the resurrection of Jesus is a proof for God. So, like, yeah, no, I have to, like, I have to, based on my knowledge that a lot of stuff in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the New Testament, appears very clearly to have been borrowed, stolen from previous civilizations like the Babylonians, then I would seriously doubt, in that resurrection actually took place.
Yeah, and this is kind of interesting because, and this is kind of a personal story, but see, there was a time when my mom was concerned. She was wondering whether after she was dead, whether she should be buried or cremated, because she was thinking that if she was cremated, then God wouldn't be able to resurrect her body from the dead or something like that. Something like that. And so, I mean, I tend to think that like, is it really possible to reassemble a burnt, cremated body and reverse the process of death and bring the person back?
Yeah, to me it sounds like that's trying to make 1 + 1 = 3. You
Yeah,
know,
because
yeah.
I don't think that could really be done. I don't think you could do that any more than if a house burns down and a house made of wood burns down, that you could take those ashes and turn them back into the wood. You have to get new wood from new trees, to rebuild a house.
That makes sense. Jamie, what's your take on this?
Remind me where we're up to again. Sorry.
Oh, just that, this idea of resurrection, that God could raise people from the dead. Somebody who's been dead for 3, 4 days, God could just, like, restore the person to life.
Um, I think it'll be a. I'm just saying, if someone can come back from the dead, if it can happen, because I've mentioned this in the past, when I said, I believe that through law of conservation, afterlife is possible in a physical sense. Like physical material recollecting elsewhere, and the person's consciousness being in a completely different body somewhere else. But I don't believe it in a spiritual sense for obvious reasons.
Right.
And
And Chandler, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think I think resurrecting someone would be a long, drawn-out process. It wouldn't happen in just 3 days, man. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up this question because, like, in science, we
Mm.
have this, what is it, cryonics or cryogenics? It's this
Mhm.
idea that we're freezing people, and unfortunately, we haven't figured out how to thaw them without like severe damage to blood vessels and all that. But theoretically, they, for example, there's, think about a heart, a heart transplant, right? They take a heart out of somebody, and this heart is not beating, it's not doing anything. They put it into someone, and I don't know how they do it. I guess there's some kind of electricity. They get that thing working, and all of a sudden the person is alive again. So it could be that we might develop the technology to bring back somebody who's dead from the dead, provided that the physical structures, as you were saying, were preserved, not like a house that's burnt down.
Right.
But, yep.
Yeah, because I don't think it's possible after somebody's been completely cremated, the body's been completely destroyed, that there's any way for humans to reassemble it. But I would like to mention there's a movie called Idiocracy about a guy who's cryogenically frozen for 500 years. You got to see that.
Oh, I saw it. That's great.
Oh, you did? It's awesome.
Yes, that's a warning to us who are like more intelligent than the average person, that if we don't procreate, then the future is going to be filled with very unintelligent people.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting. But yeah, it's an interesting thought because like cryogenically freezing someone then bringing them back, I think that's a doable thing. It's certainly different because you're just putting someone into a long sleep, but it's not the same as them actually dying and then coming back.
That's a good question. I mean, like, it's hard to say because, like, they have a conception of clinical death. I think it's when I think there's a few criteria, like the heart stops beating, and then there's no electrical activity in the brain. Now, my understanding is, like, I think there's been cases of some people who've been, like, pronounced clinically dead, and then they're able to revive them. But again, that doesn't reflect what you're saying before about, the physical structures there apparently are intact. They haven't begun to disintegrate to the extent that they couldn't be revived.
And I would say a good analogy for this is like with a computer. When a computer shuts down and it's off, the physical structure is intact. It's just asleep. So it's kind of frozen in a way, but you turn it back on, all the data is still there. But if a computer was destroyed by a tornado or just completely destroyed, there's no way to reassemble the parts and get the data back on your hard drive.
That's a good analogy, absolutely.
And the data is kind of what makes the person, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's continue with and we got to get to that because that we'll get to that I guess eventually. Just all right. The next thing is, like, God is defined as omniscient, all-knowing. What do you guys take on that? Can that definition of God be presented as logical?
Well, I'm not so sure that something can be all-knowing exactly. Because to literally know everything, it would seem kind of like I mean, I can't conceive of something that knows everything, if you know what I mean, because I think that they're that just it's kind of difficult because knowing everything, which of course, if there was an omniscient being, would know the future. We're agreed on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because it knows exactly everything, including what will happen, every atom, how it's moving, all that kind of thing, which of course just happens to fit in very well with determinism and our no free will idea in general that this podcast is about. So I mean, it's a cool idea. I just don't necessarily believe that there is like Laplace's demon or God that could know everything.
All right. Well, let's explore that now. Like, would we say that in order to know everything, a being would have to be everything?
Huh. Well, that's an interesting thought. Because yeah, you would kind of have to be everything because if there was you and then there was something else that was not you, how could you know the not you? You would have to, you can only know you. I don't know. That's just my thought of
No,
it.
exactly, exactly. And another way we can understand this is like if if we have a being that's governing everything, wouldn't that being have to know everything?
Um, yeah, in a certain sense, because an example. So if you, an all-knowing being would be able to do what we humans cannot. For example, like scientists can look at the brain of a person, for example, but they don't know. You can't look at the brain of a person and just by that know what their favorite color is. You can't look at it and know what they ate for breakfast yesterday. The person only knows that themselves. They have to tell you. There's no way to access the mind, the memories of a person without a person telling you. So this God that would be omniscient would have to be able to experience the memories and know all the details, the preferences of food, colors, or sexual preferences, or whatever. Would have to know all of that about each person.
Yes, and again, so like if we're defining God as like as first of all creating everything, at least the known universe, and then being everything, and then governing everything or determine what can and cannot happen, I think from those three premises, I think we could understand how a being like that could conceivably know everything, or not even could, would have to know everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And as far as the knowing of everything, it gets into some interesting things because one of the common questions of theists is like, well, if God knew that this tragedy was going to happen, and that this person was gonna go and bomb this place or shoot a bunch of people, then why didn't God tell those people so they could avoid that tragedy? That seems to be one of their things.
Or why
Okay,
didn't
and
it stop
then
happening? Period. Yeah.
say that again, Jamie.
Or why didn't God stop that from happening? Period.
Yeah, and actually, we'll get into that next. But before we do, I just wanted to make one more point about the all-knowing thing. Is that I don't think all-knowing means that knowing how to make 1 + 1 = 3, right?
Yeah.
So just as there are limits to power, there has to be limits to knowledge. It has to make sense.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get to this because you're right. So we've got five attributes of God, fundamental attributes that seem to logically correlate with what we know about the universe, both the observable universe and the theoretical eternal universe. But now let's get to an attribute of God that I believe is clearly mistaken. Yes, that God is omnibenevolent, all good. Okay, now, as you guys are saying, like, how can God, if God created everything, and is governing everything, and yet there's evil, there's pain, there's suffering, and that God must be causing it, because obviously, God is the only thing that has power. How can we call a being like that, a God like that, all good?
Well, what's interesting about the omnibenevolence is, first of all, it's not something that is even in the writings of religions that I know of. It's just for example, we know the Bible clearly portrays God as making peace, doing both good and evil. So I think omnibenevolence. I don't even know how that ends up in the list. And one of the primary arguments against the existence of God is, the problem of evil. How can all powerful and all good God allow this evil? And it would make a lot more sense to just drop the omnibenevolence as being nonsensical because that doesn't fit.
All right. So in other words, what we're saying is the one attribute that Wiki includes, we're kind of saying that it wasn't in the Bible. You're right. I mean, like again, the Old Testament, Isaiah says God creates good, God creates evil. So,
Yeah, one way, George, that people get around it is divine command theory, that something's good when God does it, or when God commands it, it's good, which just means that everything that happens is good, which kind of eliminates the meaning of good.
exactly. That's kind of like begging the question. It's kind of like, yeah. All right. So now let's get into some more difficult ones that, like, unfortunately, we weren't able to like get into them on Sunday. But for example, God is also defined as, well, actually, like before we get to that, incorporeal, immaterial. That I think has to be clearly wrong. What do you guys think?
Yeah, because immaterial is kind of a weird thing because if it's not material, that seems like it doesn't exist, because as far as I can understand, everything's material, even light and heat and everything has to be material. That means, it can be physically touched.
Right. Now, so like now there may be, see, like with this term incorporeal, immaterial, it may depend again on what sense we're applying it. In other words, like for example, if we posit that the universe had a beginning with the Big Bang, we're also positing that time and space and matter began with the Big Bang. And logic tells me that matter must have existed before the Big Bang, you know, but we have no evidence of it. So in that sense, I think maybe that to define God as immaterial or incorporeal would mean that, well, first of all, that God is both material and I think that the accurate definition would have to be that God is both material and immaterial, corporeal and incorporeal, and the immaterial and corporeal parts I think would be, for example, analogous to, for example, gravity. We know gravity exists. We can measure it. We haven't detected a gravity particle or gravity waves. We have this dark matter, dark energy that we know exerts a gravitational force, but that's pretty much all we know about it. We haven't detected it. So, like, basically, I think what's immaterial, I think, is simply part of the universe that we haven't been able to detect. So,
Yeah,
how?
I mean, certainly there's a lot of things going on that humans aren't able to see. Before microscopes, all the microorganisms, that were discovered, when people didn't know about them. So that left them very confused about, when somebody got sick and there was bacteria, like, they didn't get it because they didn't have a way of viewing those things. But I would just say maybe things that we describe as immaterial are just maybe too small for us to detect.
Exactly, exactly. Too small, or maybe that's the only criteria. There may be.
Or some things are just simply masks. Like take black holes for example. The reason why you can't see the singularity is because, well, light can't escape. So you can't see the center, but we know black holes exist because of the behavior they exert on objects around them. Yeah.
Excellent. So the properties of some forms of matter just defy detection.
Mm.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thought. We just have another one of those unknown variables.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So let's say the next one is that God is defined as divine simplicity. Can you guys like help? I'm not sure I understand that.
There's nothing simple about this. Yeah, I'm not sure because I know that's one of the attributes, but I never understood about the simpleness. So I don't even know what that meant by that.
All right. I think what would, well, even though Wiki includes it, it seems to be a vague, nebulous kind of a concept. So I think what it might mean that God is its very essence, I think I may have read this, is indivisible. God is one, unitary and all. Now I would have to say, well, no, that, God is like certainly one, but obviously God is divided into all these galaxies, all these particles. God can't be, just this, I mean, this indivisible, reality. Otherwise, nothing else could be.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I think simple has too many loaded meanings to be useful when describing this concept of God or whatever.
Okay, but I'm gonna X it out. We're Xing out like omnibenevolent, even though we acknowledge that it's not in the Bible. Immaterial doesn't make sense, and divine simplicity doesn't make sense. Another one is, and this is going to be a very interesting one. God is a personal being. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I don't know. I tend to go by what Einstein said. I don't believe in a personal God. I think that's how he said it. Because when we think of somebody being personal, we think of another human being, for example, that we talk to, or another animal that we relate to and experience some emotional communication somehow.
Yeah, Jamie, what's your take
But taking what?
on whether God can be accurately defined as a personal being?
Mm, I'm not gonna comment on that because that's not my belief. I'm just an agnostic atheist. I don't believe that there's spiritual beings.
Okay, here's my take. I mean, like,
Mm,
on the one sense, I can I can see how a God who is governing not just this planet, who created all these hundreds of billions of galaxies. I'm not sure we could refer to that kind of God as a quote unquote personal God in the sense of being like human beings and all. But what I'm thinking is, for example, if God is everything and everywhere, if God has to be everything, to rule everything, to know everything, whatever, um, we are part of God. So, all right, and like, because we also have to acknowledge that, like, because of causality, what's happening today really was set into motion, before the Big Bang, at least 13.8 billion years ago. So, in other words, like, sometimes the objection is that, like, well, if we pray to God or if we communicate to God, is God communicating to us in real time? And that's kind of like asking if, like, for example, right now we're having a discussion, but everything we're saying, everything we're hearing, this whole exploration has been predetermined. So can we actually say that we're, you know, taking personal, that this is a personal experience, or is it an experience that's compelled upon us by the universe that may or may not be defined as personal?
Well, I think we're basically even our so-called personal interactions are kind of an impersonal process playing out. For example, the reason I called our other podcast Impersonal Opinion is that because nothing is original to us because we don't have a free will. We're not the author of this. It in a way, yeah, and because it is, predetermined by prior causes because everything is. I get that.
Right. Okay. So, like, and like, I'm just like, I want to try to look up the definition of personal, because I'm not sure what they mean by that. Personal. Let's see. Okay, personal, of, affecting, or belonging to a particular person rather than to anyone else. That's weird because, like, if see, you can define the universe, God, as a thing, or you can define it as a being. In other words, like, with the Earth, there's this Gaia theory that's actually, when it was presented in the early 60s, it was highly criticized. But now it's pretty much established that the Earth is a self-regulating organism, in a sense. Like, it'll regulate its climate, it'll regulate various aspects of itself. So, so now, all right, this definition, of, affecting, or belonging to a particular person rather than to anything, anyone else. Now, my question is, like, if God or the universe is only one, how could there be anyone else? You know, and then the question is like, should we define what created us, you know, the essence of reality as a thing, or should we define it as a being?
Well, I'm not sure it makes too much of a difference either way. Um, because either way, even if you define it as a personal or a being or whatever, it's still one. It's still one thing. And so the idea of there being separate beings is out. So I'm suggesting a kind of monism, all is one sort of a thing.
Right, and you're right. I think that, like, you know, the distinction between whether we call ourselves persons or things, or whether we call the universe or God a person or a thing, I think it's a semantic distinction, right? I mean, like, I'm not sure there's a difference. It's like one. I think like we relate to each other as people. We identify ourselves as persons. It kind of like separates us from inanimate, you know, matter. I guess it's a pragmatic distinction. Um,
Yeah, and here's a way I like to describe it because even though we deal in a world where there's the concept of different people, we understand that there's nothing that we're saying, nothing we're experiencing is truly original to Chandler, George, or Jamie. Sure, physically we're in different locations and different places on this planet, but nothing is original to us, nothing is owned by us.
Yeah,
exactly.
and the only reason we're still alive right now is because oxygen is still reaching our brains. So, you know.
Yep.
All right, so now we're at the 10th and last definition of God and Wiki, and this one's another one that I would disagree with. Well, I mean, it's hard to say. They define God as the source of moral obligation. Jamie, what's your take on that?
Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, Wiki defines God in its 10 definitions of the attributes of God. The 10th one is that God is the source of moral obligation.
Hmm.
How does
Well,
that sound?
yeah, the concept of morality becomes really troublesome when you throw free will out. You know, because without free will, where does morality come in? Where does morality exist? Does it exist on a societal level or at the fundamental level from within ourselves? You know?
Well, here's the deal, Jamie. I think there's a difference between morality and moral obligation or moral responsibility. I mean, those are two different concepts, and I really wanted to talk more about morality with the co-hosts because I hold to the idea that morality is a real thing, but we're not morally responsible as creditor blameworthy. So there's a distinction there.
Yeah, true. I mean, you got practical reasons to have law and order, but um, that doesn't necessarily mean that the criminals deserve their punishment per se, does it? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, and morality is a practical matter. I think that people make a mistake when they say, "Oh, well, we have laws for and moral ideas for practical reasons, therefore there's no morality." I'm like, no, that really is is what morality is.
Yeah. Well, morality came as a way for a species to survive in the greatest number, didn't it? So.
Yeah, in that sort of a way, because morality is because we are obligated to survive, because we seek pleasure and avoid pain, we do have moral obligation in that sense. So I think what George was saying is one of the things that God is somehow defined as the source of moral obligation. So,
But Chandler, no, I agree with you. I think the right term is that God is the source of moral responsibility because we human beings don't have a free will. You know, what we do isn't up to us. So if we're going to assign morality to anything, it has to be to whatever makes us do what we do. But I think you correctly pointed out that there's a difference between moral responsibility and moral obligation.
yes, definitely a distinction. And whatever obligation or responsibility is defined, well, of course it would have to be, you would say that the universe or God or whatever is the source of it, and I don't think that's controversial.
Okay, all right. So now we've gone through the 10 attributes, and I think the five most fundamental attributes being like the creator, all powerful, eternal, omnipresent, and all knowing, I think, we've agreed that we can logically make arguments that God defined as that does exist. So then when we get to omnibenevolent, we obviously reject that, but then as Chandler points out, it's not in the Bible. Then when we get to immaterial, incorporeal, we have to reject that. Divine simplicity, that's so vague that we don't, I'm not sure what we do with that. A personal being, I think we may want to reject that, I think, because that's kind of like anthropocentric. Um,
Yeah.
and and then a source of moral, I think we have to change a source of moral obligation to a source of moral responsibility. And I think, it could have been that the Wiki editors got this wrong in terms of the no, 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 they probably got it right, because like basically like one thing we're arguing against, like traditional conceptions of God, is that he granted us free will. So, all right, so like moral obligation is wrong. So basically, what we're saying is that out of the 10 fundamental attributes of God, the first five, the most fundamental, we can argue for, and the next five, they seem incorrect, at least in some important ways. And all right, so like when we think of that, relative to like our knowledge of the universe, think of like our conception of the universe before the Big Bang. Think of our conception of gravity before Einstein, and space and time before relativity. In other words, like in science, we had this understanding of how we thought the universe worked, let's say back in the 16 and 1700s, and now we kind of like understand that we were wrong in a lot of ways, that, especially with quantum, phenomenon, entanglement and all that. The universe is in some ways very different than what we thought it was, but we don't, therefore, as a result of this new, refined, more accurate knowledge, we don't say that the universe as it was defined back then didn't exist or doesn't exist. We just say that the universe wasn't understood correctly or precisely enough. So that's my argument for God. In other words, like, it's not that God doesn't exist, it's that God was not, and still is not today, understood as accurately as I think logic dictates. And so it's interesting. So like I think that maybe a more correct term for than atheist might be, as I wrote in an email recently, acutheist. That basically, like, that what we're advocating for is not, or at least what I'm advocating for, is not for the elimination of God as a concept, because again, as we saw, these first five attributes really fit in with how God was traditionally defined, but rather an accurate description of God, just as we're trying to create a more and more accurate description of the universe. Guys, how's that sound?
Well, I kind of get what you're saying because we've kind of got the three blind men and an elephant sort of a deal. Just because these blind men thought that the elephant was different things because they were only, felt the leg, one felt the trunk, one felt something else. It doesn't mean that there wasn't an elephant these blind men were trying to describe. Is that what you're saying?
Chandler, that's it exactly. That's it exactly. That basically, like, yes, in order, like, we didn't understand God correctly back then. Who knows, we may not ever understand God correctly, completely, just as like we may not ever completely understand the universe correctly and completely. But right, that doesn't mean that the universe doesn't exist or that God wouldn't exist.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting idea. Now, So basically, kind of God became a term used to describe the unknown forces of nature or reality or the universe or whatever. And so it became sort of the unknown thing. People would describe this as the gods. I don't know whatever they used in
Chandler?
their language.
What
But
happened?
what? You still there, George? What happened? I don't hear George.
I don't know. I lost you. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
All right. I don't know what happened, but we're back. So I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. So what I was saying is that basically people they were describing these unknown forces of nature or reality or the universe as God, although in their language it might have been a different word than the word God. I don't know when that word first appeared, but so basically there's still the forces of nature that do exist, but people have taken the word God and then described it as an omnibenevolent person or a human-like being, and you're kind of saying that that's a wrong description.
Exactly. And again, like it's the same thing that's happened with science. Like in the fourth, like remember, before Copernicus, we scientifically thought, well, I don't know if scientifically, we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. We very rationally thought that the Earth was flat, that it was motionless. I mean, it made sense to us, right? So, like, our conception of our world, of our universe, was so different back then than it is now that we have more knowledge. But we don't say, well, because we were so wrong, the earth doesn't exist, the universe exists. We just didn't understand it very well. And so, like, just as we can understand the nature of the universe, more and more precisely, and we are, I think we can, like, understand the nature of God, defined in a way that kind of like is really, in many ways, synonymous with the universe, with more and more accuracy.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a thing, not understanding something doesn't mean that something's not going on. It's just that you don't understand it.
Right. Now, here's the value of this. The value of this is like before science, all they had was hearsay. Some guy, says he talked to God and God said this. And like, they didn't know any better. So they said, all right, this guy seems believable. We'll believe him. So they were basing their understanding on what some guy said. And that's the kind of like religion that we have now. That's Judaism, that's Christianity, that's Islam,
Yeah.
it's Buddhism also. And so what I'm saying is like if we want to move away from that revelation prophecy based, conception of God and religion and reality, which has so many problems, to a more scientific, rational understanding.
Yeah, this is interesting. Now, yeah, I mean, I agree that, the religions that we have now, they are just based on hearsay. Some dude said something, and people just like, oh, well, the authority figure said it, so it's true. Um, and of course, I find that can happen with anything. People are easily, convinced by celebrities to believe whatever. But so we do face a challenge though. Now, so let's say that you have, when Christians tell you that you're going to hell, like how do you, with this kind of understanding of God that you have, how do you respond to that when they say that?
Well, it's perfect. All right. Like our scientific understanding of reality, of the law of cause and effect, tells us that none of us is responsible for anything we do. So it seems like it's much, much more likely that there is no hell than that the universe, God, the laws of nature would be so unfair as to make us do things that are wrong and then punish us eternally for them.
Yeah, it's true because here's the deal. All of the co-hosts that do this podcast agree on the lack of free will anyway. So of course, we're not responsible and deserving of anything that happens to us in this life or an afterlife if there was an afterlife. So I think we have the most important point that the most harmful aspects of religion we're already immune from, because we understand that that requires free will belief. So perhaps I think the main thing is that religions fall apart as soon as you stop believing in free will, even if you believe in a concept of God. So I think the free will thing is the real target, that the concept that has to be eliminated, not necessarily the God concept.
Well, I agree with you to the extent also that, for example, I think it's this belief in free will that that has people clinging to religion, because I think in their minds they're saying to themselves, "Oh my God, if I don't believe in free will, then I'm kind of like violating this central tenet of my religion, and the priests and the ministers and rabbis are telling me that if I do that, I might end up suffering for eternity." So yes, this free will belief is kind of like an extortion. It's basically like, it scares people into not challenging the religion, the rest of the religion.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, just as Felicia Hogan, she learned that free will was false first before leaving Christianity. And I kind of wish, I think that's an easier way, than the reverse way that I did. Because I think what happens is, because we have a perfect explanation for why we don't have free will, and that we're caused to do everything we do by prior causes of biology and environment further back, long before we were born, before we were conceived, all that. So, because we absolutely have a firm foundation that no, we're not morally responsible for anything in the strong sense, therefore, we don't have to be feeling guilty and concerned. We don't have to live in fear of the claims that these religions are making, that there's some God that's blaming us and going to send us to hell and stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and again, without that fear, then we're just freer to rationally, investigate religion, to oppose it, based on reason, and to change it. Because, like, I think, what we're doing with this episode, and what we're also doing with the entire free will project, is that we're moving this whole um, exploration of the nature of reality from hearsay to reason. In other words, like, we're not going to accept anything unless it makes sense, unless it has some evidence, unless there's a substantive reason. Whereas, and here's the problem with, all right, if we want to be pragmatic about this, if we want to, like, be able to change the world in the next centuries or whatever, it may make sense to, rather than denying God's existence, it may make sense to basically explain existence within God, of the existence of God, but within the existence of God that people can understand. That's not based on what somebody a few thousand years ago said, because then what happens is, then, like, all of a sudden the Bible and the Quran and all these religious texts as quote unquote authority lose their authority. Then we're basically kind of like creating our spiritual, theistic, religious understanding of reality no longer based on this evidence that's so flawed, so subject. I mean, like, you've got all these religions, all believing they're right. I mean, how? That's the height of insanity, So
Yeah.
basically, what I'm saying is, religion today has been hijacked by people who are very unintelligent, and that's I think what's led to the modern atheist movement. It's a rational reaction, to this insanity.
Yeah, I would have to agree there. And so it is a difficult thing, because now, like, the term, like, now I can see how the term atheist can be kind of problematic, because of the fact that there are infinite different beliefs in God. There's infinite conceptions of God. That each religion has a different one, and some will say that God has this attribute. Other religious groups will say no, God doesn't have this attributes, but has this one instead. So it's difficult. It's almost like saying like that you don't believe in Bob, and there's many guys out there named Bob. So which one does it refer to?
Chandler, that's it. That's it. I mean, like, so I think that, because, the atheist would have to like just be challenging various often conflicting, sometimes completely opposite conceptions of what religion is, what God is. I think that maybe like the more proper or realistic, practical, useful, basic strategy might be to not be atheist, but rather acutheist. To acknowledge, fine, God is the creator, well, the world has a creator. God is all powerful, well, the laws of nature. And, to acknowledge, fine, God exists, but the world is vastly, deeply, profoundly mistaken about the nature of God. And again, we can move this debate from theism, which like the problem with theism today with religions is like it's a belief, and you can't argue belief, right? You
Right.
can
Yeah, because beliefs are, yeah, I mean, it's like beliefs are caused by prior experiences and evidence that you've seen, but a belief is not evidence in itself. It's not an argument.
Right, and on belief, like based on like the Bible says that the Bible is true, so the Bible is true because the Bible says it's true. I mean that's
Yeah, that's the problem. And similarly, George, we have another case because the morality thing. Because you've got people saying morality doesn't exist, for example, and we were talking about that a little bit earlier. And for example, Mitch with his deontology, kind of like, oh, morality is just a dogma, but it's just kind of whereas, like for example, Trick is more of a more realist, and like I think you and I and Trick tend to agree, like, morality is based on the pleasure and pain. There is a real morality, and just because people have different moral frameworks doesn't mean that there isn't a morality.
exactly. So like I think what we would have to conclude is like we can only guess as what is the moral act or lack thereof, but that doesn't mean, our limitation in understanding the absolute nature of reality in no way means that reality doesn't exist. It means like just like with everything else, we can only understand, reality from our subjective position.
Yeah, and so it's an interesting thing now. So how should we handle this? Like when somebody asks us if we believe in God, should we say which God?
Well, I like this term, I'm going from like, I no longer consider myself a pantheist as a result of this. Because again, I did a bit more research on pantheism, and it doesn't accurately reflect my views. I think I'm more of an acutheist. Like I'm a theist because I believe that God and the universe are synonymous, but I'm about accurately understanding God, rejecting the conventional notions. you know, I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's interesting though. So if you think that you need a new term and the pantheist no longer suits you, then this is definitely something to consider because, see, my thing is that like it because we had to spend about an hour and a half just about to in this podcast just going through these attributes and coming to what you think is the right conception of God, and I'm still not sure I completely agree with it, you understand.
No, of course, of course.
But I do think that most people, they don't take the time to go through that and like what go through each of these attributes and what they mean. Most people, they're just believing in the God as described in the Bible. That's all true because their parents and their church told them that it is. And so what I think what we need to say is people need to have a rational investigation of how God is defined and these attributes, so then they can come to a conclusion that's not based off of just hearsay, but they've actually studied it and discussed it.
Exactly. And the other kind of like shift that we'd want to promote is that in the past, these religious leaders would make a conclusion and say, this is the way things are, this is the way God is, this is the way reality is, and it's unchangeable. We are absolutely sure. Whereas science says, like, this is our understanding of reality at the present day. We have to acknowledge, at least for most cases, I don't think like it applies to everything. For example, I think causality is something that is completely irrefutable. But for most of our understanding of reality, science rightly acknowledges that this is just our understanding, in the present, and it can change. And if we apply this principle to the understanding of God, to the understanding of religion, then that's, I think, what we need. Because, like religion, it has done a lot of harm, but it also has done a lot of good. Because, like, for example, before we had our legal system, and our legal system, as you guys know, like here in the United States, throughout the world, is corrupt in a lot of ways. But before we had that, basically religion was the kind of the source for morality. They got a lot wrong. They condoned slavery. They just they would sacrifice people. But they started this system of morality that we can now extend, not from, again, this very mistaken and misguided view that somebody said something a long time ago and that's why it's true, but from a more rational, kind of like more of what Sam Harris is saying in the moral landscape, that science, our understanding, we can come up with a morality that's based on reason rather than on prophecy.
Yeah, it's interesting, and see, just like life evolves, things change and adapt. They have to their environment. I think what we're gonna just, like you mentioned, science it has had to adapt. Whenever new information comes along that people didn't know, then they had to adapt it, and so it's more willing to change than is religion. And so, it seems to me that whichever adapts and changes the easiest is going to survive, and the other will not.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. All right, we're almost. I guess we're almost at 1:30. Jamie, do you want to kind of like say any concluding remarks before I guess Chandler wraps us up?
Oh, sorry, I was a bit distracted again. Repeat that, man.
Do you want to like just say any summarizing remarks? Like we're going to wrap up the episode in a minute or two.
No, not really.
Okay.
Yeah, well, okay. So you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, George Ortega, and Jamie Soden, who's been kind of distracted. But we've had an interesting discussion about several of the commonly defined attributes of God, and the adaptation of religion and science, and how we will approach this whole topic, because it might change how we approach this topic. But yes, this has been very successful and more productive than our last episode, I think. So I hope everybody's enjoyed this episode. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.